Welcome to Image Bearers. My name is Otoma Edje. This is season 5, episode 2. I just want to let you know we have a very, very special guest today, which is Dr. Reggie Williams, who's written one of my favorite books of all time, just in reference to the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And a lot of us are familiar with his life, but perhaps maybe The Cost of Discipleship, Ethics, and some other books, but a lot of us are not perhaps aware of his time in the United States, and we are going to dive into that today. So for those of you that may not be aware, Dr. Reggie Williams is professor of ethics at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, Illinois. And as I said, he wrote one of my favorite books of all time in Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you.
Oh, man. Well, I'm going to go ahead and dive in with the first question. So obviously the title of the book is Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. To start out, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, greetings to you and your guests. Again, it's an honor to be with you. The book is an interaction with time that Bonhoeffer spent in Harlem, and it comes together as a result of two different things that I studied during my seminary days. One was theology of art in a course as a master's student, in which I looked at the Harlem Renaissance, and specifically Aaron Douglas. And then when I was in a doctoral program, a PhD program, I was a TA for my mentor, Glenn Stassen, and he was teaching a class on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He emphasized how important Harlem was for Bonhoeffer's development as a theologian. And because of my work with the Harlem Renaissance, I recognized that he was there during the Harlem Renaissance and decided to just investigate as to whether or not he mentioned it. And there was enough to write a book. So it really comes out of that. And then there's another deeper influence. That story helps me to make my own case on that book for a better kind of Christian ethics, what I call an empathic reality. It is the interaction the ability to love your neighbor as yourself, which means to understand the needs for justice in someone else's context as well as your own. So his trip from Germany to Harlem is a move into, this is not something that happens for everybody, but when you're traveling to really try to see the world from a perspective of people that you're visiting, which is what he does in Harlem. And it provides a story, an illustration of how that can work for justice, because he goes back to Germany, and what he picks up from seeing the world from the perspective of Black people in the United States helped him to see racism as a Christian problem in Germany.
Yep.
Made him less than 1% of the population who were able to do that in Germany.
Yeah. No, I was blown away. I think you wrapped it up very nicely in your book. So you call the book obviously Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, which actually put me off for a little bit. I think it has like a purple and black as a cover, and I was like, I love purple, but the title was just like, okay. But when I dove into it, it made total sense. But so for those that have not read the book, why did you call it Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus? And you kind of alluded to that a little bit already, but can you dive in perhaps a little bit more?
Yeah. There were a few names that were suggested. In the end, we went with Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus in light of the transformation that happened. There's a transformation in light of the move that he makes from a Christ, which is pretty much the center of Imperial Europe in Germany. To say Christ-centered there means something different than it does to say Christ-centered when you're talking or when you're worshiping with people who are in the wake of the slave trade and the afterlives of the slave trade. It's a difference between a recognition of Christ or a connection with Christ who's risen with all power as a result, or I should say, one who's risen with all power as opposed to one who's hidden in suffering and shame. So the Black Christ is also reference to a poem that he reads in the United States from County Cullen. It's the only one that he mentions by name, the only Harlem Renaissance poet or author that he mentions, the poem that he mentions by name. He also mentions Du Bois. But in that poem, he says a white Christ is brought out against a Black Christ. He also mentions in a letter back home during that year that in distinction from, different than the white Christ, the Black Christ is preached with rapturous passion. So he's picking up on the distinctions between white Christ, Black Christ, and the Black Christ he seems to be identified more so with the perspective of people whose whole being is under the gospel. And that's something that was important for him, because in Germany, he was, I guess you might say, put off. His family wasn't so interested in a bourgeois church. That is a compartmentalized church. That's a church where you wouldn't think twice about having your children baptized and, catechism and so forth. But what does it say about the struggles of post-war Germany, where people are committing suicide and don't have enough food to eat, and there's a lot of poverty rampant and so forth? It's a part of upper culture, of bourgeois culture, of the cultured elite, but doesn't really say anything to the experiences of suffering. That's what he learns in the United States. That's why the Black Christ, who is representative of a people who understand their entire beings under the gospel, means something to him.
Yeah, like I say, your book is just so deep. And I know he obviously was in the United States in the 1930s, 1930-31. So after obviously the 1929 crash, but before the Depression, just around that time frame. And you allude obviously to the Harlem Renaissance and so forth. And you kind of cover this a little bit, but what was Bonhoeffer's theology like before he came to the United States? And you've talked a little bit already about how it changed, but if you can maybe cover that also.
Sure. Well, I would say that his theology doesn't do a whole lot of changing. There is some developments that happen with it, more specifically with him and his faith. He writes later to, some people say this is a love interest, some people say this was a family member, but he tells a correspondent that he hadn't yet become a Christian.
Yes.
Yeah, that he hadn't yet become a Christian. And people who know, what's that?
That's deep.
Yeah, that he hadn't yet become a Christian, that it was only afterwards that he, learns to take things like the Sermon on the Mount more seriously, and things like justice, peace and justice witness. And friends notice that he's going to church. He wasn't a regular like church attendee prior to New York. And right when he gets back, he also, this is important, he starts asking questions like whether or not the church has the ability to say things directly that we must obey, that the Christian should be compelled to do. What are there any concrete commandments? Are there any concreteness to the gospel or to the Christian witness, Christian faith? These are questions that were not there for him before New York. So then he's making claims about costly grace and cheap grace,
which he got from one of his classmates. I think you had mentioned he got the costly grace, cheap grace concept from.
No, there's a really kind man who wrote something about cheap grace and world come of age, and says that these terms came from Adam Clayton Powell Sr. And when I found that while I was writing this, by the way, and I thought I'd struck gold, except I couldn't find any evidence for it at all. And
Okay.
the author of that piece asked me to do a little bit of research for him while I was doing my own research to find the receipts for that claim, and I couldn't find them. But I did find what I did find. I put in the book, and it was the closest that I could get at that time while I was writing that was a sermon that Powell preached where he says this. He says the best description of saving faith that you read in the Bible comes from Mary, the mother of Jesus, at Cana in Galilee when the wine ran out. Whatever he says to you, do it. Now, it's that claim, this phrase, whatever he says, do it, that Bonhoeffer is actually wrestling with when he gets back from New York. What are the claims that come from Christ that we must, or the gospel even, that we must follow concretely? When prior to that, he wasn't talking like that at all. There wasn't anything that can be claimed that doesn't just arise out of the moment of encounter between people, between persons, that one can claim beforehand. But then he starts talking again, about grace, cheap and costly, which also comes from an encounter that he had with one of the professors at Union, Reinhold Niebuhr. But in addition to Niebuhr and Jean Lasserre, you got to pay attention to the fact that he's worshiping at Abyssinian and meeting a community where their entire beings are under the gospel. So these are all connected. So in short, you're asking about what changed for him. And I think one real concrete example can help with this. Prior to New York, he preaches a sermon. He gives a lecture in Barcelona, Spain, as a visiting pastor in a congregation of expatriates in Spain. Mm-hmm. He gives three lectures there, one in particular called Basic Questions of a Christian Ethic. In Basic Questions of a Christian Ethic, he's speaking in really grand terms about loyalty to his German people. Keep in mind, this is post-World War I, and they're suffering from shame, having the whole war having all the war guilt placed on them, and a huge reparations bill to the Allies who beat them in the war. So there's shame, and then there's humiliation. And he's speaking in these grand terms about his people, about love for people can sanctify murder, can sanctify war. These are Christian things that people would say, that war can be sanctified for the sake of love for my people. He comes back, and this is 1929 when he's saying this, he's given this lecture. Comes back from Germany, from Harlem in 1931, the summer of 1931, and within weeks of his return, he writes a catechism. In this catechism, he says things like, the Christian only prays for peace. All war talk out the window. He also says some things about God has made from one blood all nations that dwell on the earth.
Credo.
So an ethnic pride is a sin against the Holy Spirit. He calls it ethnic pride unpardonable sin. Now that means something in the context of a burgeoning Nazi movement. And they also, at that time, they had a eugenics movement that spoke of master race, Herrenfolk, a higher people, a master people. The folk is a people language, but we might even translate it into the concept of an ideal person, superior people, the Herrenfolk. That was already a language that was there before the Nazis started using the language of Herrenrasse, master race, Herrenrace. So he says ethnic pride is a sin against the Holy Spirit in opposition to this language, this sentiment that's already there, idolizing a Germanic people. Then he says, even though it's uncomfortable for a Christian, I'm paraphrasing, it may be uncomfortable to do so, the time may come when you have to stand up against political structures or systems for the sake of love of your neighbor. Political action guided by faith against this concept of master race. That's right there when he comes back within weeks of his return from Harlem. That's evidence of transformation, or at least one might say of conversion. Now, what that does to his theology is it leads it to a more concrete, Christ-centered thing for him that's more personal and confessional. And it also seems to take, I would argue, his focus on, I mean, this theological concept of Christ for him as our vicarious representation, away from a specific German focus on it into a more church, church, international.
Right.
He's got a more international focus, a more robust interaction with Christology and the commandments of Christ.
Yeah,
that's when he comes. That's what happens in New York.
Okay, it's transformational. I think he even said that he came back with a theology that was not found with Barth or anybody. It was like something totally different than what was actually there in Germany, what he brought back from the United States. The thing I wanted to...
Not so much totally different. I wouldn't say totally different. I would say he's still very Barthian. In fact, as soon as he gets back from New York, he goes right to meet with Barth. And he's still very much tethered to Barth. In fact, when he leaves Germany during the church struggle to go pastor in London, he doesn't tell Barth until he gets there. But he's writing. He's in correspondence with Barth. He knows that Barth's going to say, "Get back there and write theology." But he doesn't want to hear it from Barth right away. So they're still pretty tight.
Well, I mean, they may have been tight, but I'm just saying, like, as far as their theology, was their theology different? It seemed like, from what I was reading, it seemed like they had a different way of looking at things.
There were differences. Bonhoeffer says that Barth is tethered to revelation a bit too much, that leaves Christ out, that doesn't allow one to recognize the immanence of Christ's transcendence. So there are differences, but he's very Barthian.
Okay. So the other thing you mentioned in your book is just the difference when Bonhoeffer visited the white churches versus the black churches. And he was like, whoa, I see the gospel here and I don't see the gospel here. Can you elucidate that a little bit?
Some of the differences are in when he gets to New York, are what one might say the distinction between a Christianity that sees itself as a civilizing message, Christianity in step with modernity. That's, on the one hand, it's a middle way between, you might say, atheism on one hand and fundamentalism on the other, that is wanting to find or chart a middle passage that is acceptable, that ends up speaking in a very similar language to the German culture Protestantism. This is liberal Christianity. And Gary Dorian has written so much on this. He's from Union Seminary. It's just a brilliant work to describe what that is. And Union Seminary is kind of a citadel of that. But it's not speaking in the same language that he hears from Abyssinian or black churches. So a white culture Christianity, liberal culture Christianity, is wondering whether or not out loud you still need to have an explicit, clear connection to things like salvation, Jesus, sin, things like that. It's charting a middle passage in a kind of a culture representation. It's kind of a civilizing message. But at Abyssinian and in black churches, he's hearing the language of sin, a clear dependence on Jesus. Jesus is, mother to the motherless, father to the fatherless, a doctor in the sick room, a lawyer in the courtroom. Jesus is all in all. And sin and salvation, these kinds of things they're still there. It's not a civilizing message. It is a co-sufferer message. And if Jesus is with us on the cross, then Jesus will bring us with him on Sunday. That's the thing. That's a clear distinction.
Yeah. Wow. Another thing you noted, which I thought was really awesome in your book, is in reference to when Bonhoeffer came back to Germany, specifically when he was in the slums of Berlin, just how he responded, and perhaps he responded differently than how he would have had he not come to the United States. Can you share about that a little bit also?
Tough to say what he would have, how he would have responded if he didn't come to the U.S. Nobody in his family supported the Nazis. Everybody in his family was against them.
Mm-hmm.
He had a brother killed in World War I, another brother who was wounded in World War I, and he, along with him, in 1945, he had another brother killed by the Nazis. His sister arrested by them. Um, Everybody was against them. The distinction, though, is that they weren't doing it because they were Christian. And it's hard to know what else Bonhoeffer would have said if he weren't Christian. He probably would have gone against them too. But he had a clear and explicit argument in opposition to them as a follower of Christ. He's sounding different before New York. He's sounding he sound like he's ready for a totalitarian regime in that lecture that I shared. But had he not gone to New York, it's tough to say. It's really tough to say. He would not have had the perspective that he did on Christ connected with suffering. I think there's no question there, because the perspective that he got on Christ in suffering, he got the specific perception that he got in the United States. Who knows if he would have had a suffering Christ perspective before?
Yeah, I think the thing that I took away, even from when he was in Abyssinia, how he worked with the various community members, helping out with whether it's, with food, whether it's, teaching the kids or whatever. And he saw that working in Abyssinia, and he brought that back to his work in Berlin.
He definitely did. I mean, there's no question there. He had an interest in kids beforehand. He certainly did. And he had an interest in helping people in poverty. He did. He did that in Berlin. And I'm sorry, in Barcelona, with kids and with poverty. However, at Abyssinian Baptist Church, he was a lay leader in a church that was at that time a clear ancestor, one might say a family member of the Black social gospel, the Black abolitionist message, Black abolitionist Christianity, which is the Black social gospel, giving out with the food giveaway, with the direct political engagement, teaching about public witness, these hands in the community, politically, and debt relief, so forth, during the Great Depression. And he was there volunteering, teaching, participating in that specific church, which also says something about him, that he chose that church in that message. So these things that were unquestionably a part of his New York experience specifically were there with him when he goes back to Harlem. And he's telling stories to the kids that he's teaching catechism, and to the people that he's teaching at Finkenwald and at the university, while carrying the music.
Including playing the old Negro spirituals.
Yeah, playing the music and describing it, talking about it. This is clearly with him.
Right. So again, I think going too far, it may not be the best thing to one degree, as far as assuming what one might say. But if Bonhoeffer were here today, what do you think he might say to the contemporary church? Specifically, I guess if we look at it the other way around, what do you think they would say to him if he's doing the same things he was doing then now? Okay. Would they say, like, for example, he has a woke mind virus? I mean, this is something that has been
Yeah.
said to people who just like, wait a minute, there's a difference between going crazy in terms of, perhaps something that's not biblically based, but from what I can tell, Bonhoeffer definitely was following the scriptures and what he was doing. But I think there's such a backlash today in some parts, not in all parts, in some parts of the Christian faith, that anyone who seems to help those that may be in need are considered like, have the woke mind virus or something, some kind of aspersion is said towards them. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that language comes from a demographic of Christian that is comfortable with status quo or political structures that ignore this the poor and the socially harmed. That to draw attention to social issues, maybe to draw one's attention from the work of the gospel, to use that language. And that is obviously, for anybody really paying attention, not what Dietrich Bonhoeffer was doing.
Right.
Now, he had plenty of things, there are plenty of things that I disagree with him on. No question there. And, he's a conversation partner for me, a constant conversation partner for me as a representative of, Christian ethics, which I can say more about later. But it is no question that he's trying to do what he understands to be right. And for him, that is paying attention to people who are harmed by political structures, harmed socially. No question there. He would ask, as he was asking in his time, who is Christ for us today? Who is Jesus for us today? You know the answer to that question by paying attention not to people who are comfortable and well-fed in the community that you call good,
right,
but by paying attention to people who are harmed in the community that you call good, in what you describe as your ideal community. That's what his focus was. He said things like, when during the rise of Nazism, when nobody could have guessed that it would turn into a genocidal regime, he said things like, writing back to people in New York, we need an ACLU here in Germany. Now, which Christians today are advocating for the ACLU's work? That should tell you something of his social Christian witness.
Yeah, wow.
You should pay attention to the perspective of people who are harmed, and we need somebody to advocate for these folks who are being crushed.
Mm-hmm.
That's his Christian witness.
So in your book, you bring up two terms. I can say one, pro nobis, and the other one sounds like Stellvertretung. I don't know. I'm probably butchering that. What he said.
Yeah. Stellvertretung. Yeah.
Why are these two words? What are they, first of all, and why are they important for every disciple to have as a mindset?
Well, they describe who Jesus is for Bonhoeffer. The language of pro nobis corresponds with pro me for him. That's not only what Jesus does, he's for us, but also who Jesus is. Stellvertretung. Stellvertreter is a word. It connects two German words, Stelle and Eintreten, to describe vicarious representation. One way to think of it is that we in our sin and shame can't stand before God. Christ stands in for us and becomes us for us. He's there for us. That's pro nobis. He is us for us. Is one way to say that. But he's also, because he stands in for us, stands in for all of humanity as a collective person. You don't have an encounter with a person that does not include encountering Christ. So the church is the community of people who are yielded to Christ. But Christ is, in one sense, he is the new humanity since the incarnation. But he's also more than that. he is the new reality since the incarnation, as he describes in his posthumously published Ethics. He's us, for us. To say yes to Christ in the encounter that you have with another person is to greet Christ in your neighbor, is to yield to Christ. It's to accept Christ, is to be able to accept that the call of Christ to love your neighbor as yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a deep concept. I can't pronounce it, but that's a very deep concept.
Stellvertretung. Stellvertretung.
Stellvertretung.
I mean, it's much more. There's much more to say about that, but in one sense, it's just vicarious representation.
Gotcha. So I do have actually 2 questions that I didn't have on my initial list, but hopefully they shouldn't be too difficult. What would you say is the best book in the last 50 years, outside of yours, obviously?
on Dietrich?
No, just in general. Any Christian spiritual book that you would say is the best book in the last 50 years?
Wow, the best Christian book in the last 50 years. You know, I'd have to think about that one. I'm reading so many all the time, but one of them that I would say, one that comes to mind that's really helpful, I would immediately, is Willie Jennings' book, After Whiteness, An Education in Belonging. It's about Christian education. This is a fantastic book. It just happens to be right here.
Can I see the cover? Okay.
I have it right here.
Interesting.
I love that book. And, you know, and another book that he wrote called The Christian Imagination. That's just brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. So Willie's a very good friend of mine too. And that brother is, he is a gem. He's brilliant.
Yeah, I went through Christian Imagination.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
It's a good book.
Okay. And then I'm guessing that probably would be the same book you would recommend. If you'd say another book outside of that one, what book would you recommend that people read this year? Other than maybe After Whiteness.
I guess it depends on what the intent, what's the aim, what is the goal here? Because I'm going to think of a few. I know I'm going to think of a few once we're done talking here. That people read this year. So the educator and the student of theology should read After Whiteness. The person in pew, anybody, any old person. Let me think about that. What else do I have on my desk here? What else do I have on my desk? Shoot. These questions always catch me off guard because I'm assigning a bunch of books too, but for just for fun, or just personal growth or education, I struggle with that because I'm always reading intentionally right now. I'm writing stuff. But I'm going to sit with those 2 for now.
Okay.
I always recommend people read Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. That's not that's not a recent book, but that's one of my favorite books of all time.
Okay. All right. As we go ahead and wrap it up here, what are some projects that you're working on? Is there anything else you'd like to share with us about yourself, your life, these kinds of things?
I'm working on a project, right? 2 different projects, actually 3. I'm supposed to have had this commentary completed on Joshua and Judges. It's a little light reading, but I'm also working on a bigger project. I've got a few chapters written and some other essays that may help. It may fit in there somehow. That's an intervention on the way we think about human being. Now, that's a bit of a direct interaction with my field of Christian ethics. But when we talk about human, we're not talking about a biological concept, we're not talking about a biological being. We're actually talking about a European concept. We need to be able to recognize that in order to address the problems that we're always trying to face, because they're attached to that European concept. So when we say human, we're actually interacting with the concept that has all of the stuff that we are trying to undo. So another way of thinking about it is, there are other concepts of human that aren't European, that automatically raise ways of being that aren't racist, sexist, and so forth. Think about Ubuntu, for example. That way of being is automatically collective and not individual, reason-based, masculine, so forth. It's the European version that has attached to it all sorts of different problems. So what if we think ethics from different ways of being? That's one of the things I'm working on right now. I could say more about that. When we watch Black Panther, we're watching an intervention in the human, because it takes history, Black history, and imagines Black differently. It's an intervention at the moment in which a lot of the caricatures are being assembled for a purpose. So the slave trade includes within it a need to argue for human hierarchy as we're building an understanding of human being in the West. And that understanding of human being has an apex. It has an ideal figure at the top, oftentimes represented as Christ. And it has an anchor, which is Black. Black Panther goes back to those origin moments in which Black people are being captured, and puts the Panther there and puts Wakanda there. Imagine what Black would be like if Wakanda were the representation of it. So it's when we think about it offers a different connection to the history of Black than what is offered by the historical arguments for white supremacy. That is an aesthetic intervention with human being that's happening actually in the Harlem Renaissance, which is what Bonhoeffer also encounters, an aesthetic intervention with the human. But here I'm doing it again in a different way right now. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think definitely the aspect that you mentioned as far as Ubuntu, I think that to me, I think is going to be very interesting when that gets unpacked. Now, do you have what publications these are going to come through, or any information on that? Or is that just TBD as right now?
Yeah, I'm right now working with Orbis. I'm working with Orbis for this one here. I was in conversation with a couple of different publishers, but Orbis has got this new ethics series coming out that looks really interesting, and so I decided to go to work with them.
And then the commentary.
The commentary is with Westminster John Knox.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, no, my wife just came back from South Africa, so actually in Wakanda, the blankets that are worn are actually Sutu. So the people from Lesotho, they wear blankets. So my wife is always telling me yeah, they're messing up there. That's not quite right. It's okay, let me just enjoy it.
Yeah. They're doing this Pan-African thing there in Wakanda, where they're speaking Xhosa, and they're wearing the Lesotho blankets. Is that right? And occasionally you see some Adinkra symbols in there from West Africa. all this stuff, and kente.
So good.
So kente cloth, yeah, with the mud cloths and all this stuff. Yeah, it's a Pan-African thing.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much for your time, and again, thank you for writing this book. It's been just an amazing read for me, very enlightening. I think definitely the time that you spent, as we discussed even before we started, you don't know where something's going to go. You put in the work, and you just kind of in a sense, throw it to the wind, but I'll just say I caught it, and I definitely appreciate what you wrote. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Looking forward to what you have coming next. And I will check out, I have gone through Willie James Jennings, Christian Imagination, and I'll look at this one after Whiteness also. So thank
It's
you.
brilliant. Yeah, brilliant work. All right, dear brother.
All right. Thanks so much for your time.